The Seahawks ended the season on a winning note. Unfortunately, there won't be any playoffs with the Green Bay Packers beating the Chicago Bears. We'll be breaking down the Seahawks' final victory over the Arizona Cardinals on our post-game edition of Locked On Seahawks.
You are Locked On Seahawks, your daily Seattle Seahawks podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Greetings, 12. This is Corbin Smith, host of the Locked On Seahawks podcast, your daily Seahawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Glad to be joined here on our final post-game edition of the show by my co-host in crime, Rob Rang. And a special thanks to all the 12s out there, whether you're listening here in Seattle or in the desert in Phoenix, Arizona. We greatly appreciate each and every one of you making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. Unfortunately, this is kind of an odd situation. The Seahawks won, but it doesn't feel like a win because thanks to the Green Bay Packers winning at Lambeau Field, they are not going to the postseason this year. Didn't get a lucky trip up on the road this year in Titletown to push them into the playoffs. We'll be breaking down that final season-ending victory here and looking at our game balls, our final game balls, and 3 up, 3 down coming out of State Farm Stadium. Without further ado, Rob, let's get to it. The Seahawks picking up their 9th victory this season, improving to 9-8 on the year with a 21-20 win over the Arizona Cardinals. Unfortunately, moments before they finished off that victory, they found out the Chicago Bears didn't give them the help that they needed to get into the postseason, losing to the Green Bay Packers. So it ended up being a win that, in a sense, was meaningless because even though they improved to 9-8, got a winning record, no postseason for the Seahawks. I was about to say no cigar, and then I realized that might be taken the wrong way with what's going on coming out of the locker room today. But Geno Smith able to orchestrate another game-winning drive, the 5th one he has had this season. And oh, by the way, Rob, he set a record in this game, the 7th game that he has had, 7th fourth quarter go-ahead touchdown that he has thrown this year. That is the most by a quarterback in any season in NFL history. I think we have to lead off with the positives here in this victory. Geno Smith, again, showing off that clutch gene late in regulation to beat the Arizona Cardinals.
Yeah, I 100% agree with you. I think that there is, there can be 6 months here of offseason in which we can, discuss all of the ways that the Seahawks obviously came up short. The playoffs clearly were the goal coming into the season, and the fact that the Seahawks are not qualifying for the postseason, obviously it's a huge disappointment, but there are a number of positives I think that need to be taken from this game. You kind of hinted at one of them, Corbin, which is the fact that, with still time remaining in the clock and the Seahawks victory over the Arizona Cardinals, I thought the folks in Glendale did showed some little bit of gamesmanship by just announcing on the Jumbotron essentially that the Chicago Bears had indeed lost the game. The Green Bay Packers won, and therefore the Seahawks were eliminated from the postseason, and yet the Seahawks still showed some competitiveness and marched down the field. Geno Smith threw an absolute gorgeous ball to Tyler Lockett. I have been as critical of anybody of Tyler Lockett, who obviously is a Seahawks legend. It was cool to see Tyler Lockett be able to cap off what has been a disappointing season, not only in terms of wins and losses for the club, but his own personal statistics. Geno Smith's personal statistics have been down this season after last year's spectacular campaign, but to see both of them play well, to see Will Dissly play well, to see Leonard Williams coming through with yet another strong performance. Devin Witherspoon, the rookie, a controversial selection at number 5 overall. With that, to see him be arguably Seattle's best defensive player yet again in this football game. Corbin, again, there are a million things you can criticize about the Seahawks in this game, but at the same time, I also think that we shouldn't lose sight of the positives either.
Yeah, I think Geno Smith's comeback drive, that's got to be storyline number 1, especially because you look at the way this game unfolded. Before that game-winning drive, he was 12 for 24. He had completed 50% of his passes, only had 44 passing yards the entire second half before that drive. Now, I'm not going to put a lot of that on Geno Smith. The Cardinals, you got to give them credit. They came out aggressive, sending extra blitzers, and it felt like Shane Waldron wasn't able to dial up the plays necessary to take advantage of that extra pressure. And the Cardinals were just doing a really good job against an offensive line that was missing a starter in Abraham Lucas. They were doing a good job of mixing up those blitzes and getting after Geno Smith. And so even though he wasn't sacked and there wasn't a quarterback hit in this game, they made him very uncomfortable. They got quick pressures that forced him to unload the football out of bounds on several occasions. And so the Cardinals had a really solid game plan that they executed, and still, at the end of the day, with the game on the line, even with the playoffs out of reach, Geno Smith goes 4 for 4, 67 yards, and has that beautiful 37-yard touchdown to Tyler Lockett that helped the Seahawks get this 9th victory. Now, on the flip side, this game really was a microcosm of this entire disappointing season when you think about it. The Seahawks only scored 21 points on offense. They had a lot of possessions that ended up being empty possessions, several 3-and-outs, but they were able to put it together in the end of the game when they needed to. And then on defense, early on, the Seahawks played well, but then they gave up 206 rushing yards in this game. And almost all of that came in the final 3 quarters. And they allowed the Cardinals to average almost 7 yards per play in this game. They gave up 12 explosives. That's the other storyline coming out of this game. Yes, you won. Yes, you improved to 9-8, but it really showcased why the Seahawks are not going to the playoffs, and they put themselves in this position where they needed another team to help them in Week 18.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we talk so much about the fact that the Seahawks' priority number one had to be, of course, protecting Geno Smith on the offensive side of the ball. But on the defensive side of the ball, it had to be slowing down this Arizona Cardinals running game. And the Seahawks did slow it down early in the first quarter. And then then the floodgates opened up. From the second quarter on. James Conner wound up running for 100 yards. Those of you watching on YouTube, and thank you, as Corbin always says, thank you so much to all of you watching and listening. If you are watching on YouTube, you can see the graphic that's up there. The Cardinals wound up with 206 rushing yards, 12 explosive plays, averaging 6.8 yards per play. I mean, it's hard to play any kind of defense, at least not winning defense, if you are giving up yardage in chunks the way that the Seahawks continue to do so. And, again, while I think that we need to focus in on some of the positives of this victory, I think that it's also easy to acknowledge that this wasn't a game that the Seahawks necessarily won. This was a game that the Cardinals lost. 2 field goal misses by Matt Prater in the fourth quarter. The Seahawks should have lost this football game. They lost in time of possession. They lost in yardage, as you mentioned. The Seahawks did not give up a sack or a quarterback hit. They didn't get very many of them either. The only sack of this football game was when the Arizona Cardinals quarterback Kyler Murray, I don't know why, but ran out of bounds for a 2-yard loss in the closing seconds of the football game, made Matt Prater's field goal attempt that much more difficult on him. And so Darrell Taylor got credit for that sack. But there were not a lot of big plays defensively, which is something the Seahawks have hung their hat on in the past because, again, they have been gaining up yardage in chunks. So there definitely are plenty of negatives for us to kind of be breaking down over the course of the offseason. And unfortunately, that offseason is going to begin on Monday rather than a week or 2 from now, the way that we have been hoping so much of this season.
It really is one of those live by the sword, die by the sword type situations because, as DK Metcalf said earlier in the week, they laid this bed for themselves, and unfortunately now they have to sleep in it for the next 6 months until they're back for training camp as the season comes to an abrupt end for the Seahawks. Up next, we're going to dish out our final game balls for the season on offense, defense, and special teams. Don't go away. You're listening to the post-game edition of Locked On Seahawks. This episode of Locked On Seahawks is brought to you by LinkedIn Jobs. When you're hiring for your small business, you want to have as many top-tier candidates as possible to interview, and that's why you have to check out LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn Jobs has the tools to help find the right professionals for your team faster and for free. When I was managing a site at SI, LinkedIn Jobs was my go-to to post writing positions to land top candidates. They made the process easy and seamless, and this isn't just another job board. LinkedIn has a vast network of more than 1 billion professionals, which which makes the entire process easy. It's the best place to hire. Hiring is so easy that you can get quality candidates within 24 hours. In fact, 86% of small businesses get a qualified candidate within 24 hours. LinkedIn knows that small businesses are wearing so many hats and might not have the time or the resources to hire. Thankfully, with LinkedIn, the process is intuitive, quick, and easy. LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the qualified candidates you want to talk to faster. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL. That's linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. You're listening to the post-game edition of Locked On Seahawks, the final one for the 2023 season. I'm your host, Corbin Smith. Glad to be joined, as always, by my co-host in crime, Rob Rang, and a special thanks to each and every one of the 12s out there. Thank you for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. We greatly appreciate it, as we have done each and every post-game show this year. It is time to dish out our final game balls, and it is in victory. I don't want to make that downplayed too much. The Seahawks did get the win. They have a winning record at 9-8, but expectations were much higher than that going to the season. So it's understandable why a lot of the players, why fans are frustrated with this end result. Nonetheless, a 21-20 victory over the Arizona Cardinals to end the season on a winning note. Rob, on the offensive side of the football, Seattle only scored 21 points, but it was enough to get the win. And there were several players that stood out. Who gets the game ball for you in this game on offense, and why?
Well, as I mentioned a moment ago, Corbin, I thought that the two priorities for the Seahawks on offense, number one was to protect Geno Smith against an aggressive Arizona Cardinals defense, and then on the defensive side of the ball, again, to slow down James Conner. So, considering the fact that your starter right tackle Abe Lucas was out for this game, Jason Peters, the veteran, also has been brought in, and he's played reasonably well. But again, as I've been critical of Tyler Lockett, the wide receiver position, I certainly have been critical of Stone Forsythe, and I thought that he held up very, very well. As we mentioned a couple of moments ago, the Seahawks did not surrender a single quarterback sack or hit in this football game. Now, Geno Smith and the play caller Shane Waldron, I think both deserve some credit for that. I think that the Seattle's tight ends, their running backs providing some good chip blocks as well helped. But still, there were plenty of times that Stone Forsythe was left out there on the island and had to provide excellent pass protection. I thought that he did a great job of doing so. I think that when in this kind of grand scheme of things, it's easy to overlook the offensive linemen unless they struggle. I think the Stone Forsythe deserves a little bit of a tip of the cap for the way that he wrapped up this season. Anytime the Seahawks called upon him, he was up to the challenge.
Yeah, he had a really solid game. I thought that Ken Walker III deserved some consideration for this, considering a number of the big runs he had looked to be nothing, going nowhere. And he showed off that pinball action that he's frequently done, bouncing the ball back to the other side and outrunning defenses the way few running backs in the league can do. But I actually decided before we started the show, I was torn between Ken Walker III and Tyler Lockett. I got to give Tyler Lockett the nod because he had the biggest play in the game, that 37-yard touchdown to win the game. He also caught the two-point conversion on the very next snap. So he only had two catches, but they were big ones for 71 yards. He averaged 35.5 yards per reception in this game, and he always seems to play well at State Farm Stadium. I think he's got half of his career touchdowns here. Obviously, that's an exaggeration, but he has scored a lot of touchdowns. He's got a lot of receptions in the stadium. He always seems to bring his A game. Even the game they played against the 49ers here during the COVID season, the Seahawks always seem to get a really good performance from him in Glendale. So he gets my nod on offense. As for the defensive side of the football, I think you and I are in full agreement on who gets the game ball in this one. You already mentioned his name a little bit earlier, but leading the team with 3 tackles for loss. And after the game, Quandre Diggs said he should absolutely be the rookie of the year on defense. Maybe a really nice explanation point to what's been a really good first year for Devin Witherspoon.
Yeah, exactly. I think on the offensive side of the ball, again, it's easy to point out some of the skill position players. I love that you mentioned what Kenneth Walker III did. I love that you mentioned Tyler Lockett. Again, I mean, ultimately, he made the game-winning touchdown, the game-winning two-point conversion, and there is not a player that has been more classy on and off the field, of course, than Tyler Lockett. there's going to be plenty of time to kind of acknowledge what number 16 has done. Speaking of plenty of time to acknowledge what a Seahawk has done, I mean, how bright is the future for Devon Witherspoon? I mean, you're seeing a player that, in terms of his coverage ability, in terms of his open field tackling ability, in terms of his enthusiasm, this is an easy game to basically, just kind of fold up and not really play your hardest. And yet Witherspoon was all over the field yet again in this football game. I think the Seahawks wound up with 3 tackles for loss. I believe that he had all of them. If not all of them, then certainly led the Seahawks in this game. That's very unusual, of course, for a cornerback, at least one that's not asked to blitz all of the time the way that Jamal Adams did, for example. So, yeah, to me, I think that there's some other defensive players that deserve a little bit of acknowledgement. But in terms of the game ball, I think that Devon Witherspoon absolutely is the guy that it should be the hands down winner this week, and arguably most of the weeks for the Seahawks this season.
In a game where it felt like a number of Seahawk defenders were playing Ole again against the run, this was one guy, and I'm not going to say it was perfect because Devon Witherspoon did have a bad miss on Kyler Murray on his 33-yard scramble, but you take that play out of the equation. He was the one constant today that was just flying around the field, and there's 2 plays that jump out to me. He upended James Conner on a screenplay in the 4th quarter. He got him wrapped up, and he did it this time without turning it into a WWE suplex. So he didn't get penalized this time, but he picked him up and threw him down on the ground. It was a beautifully executed tackle on a running back that is really hard to bring to the ground. And he also had another play where Kyler Murray ran a read option and was trying to use his jitterbug tendencies to get away from Devon Witherspoon. And Witherspoon sat down, got himself set, and brought Kyler Murray down at the line of scrimmage and had some words for him after the play too. That came in the 3rd quarter. So he made a couple of really impressive plays today, and it seems like he does that every single game. And this certainly is going to help his cause for Defensive Rookie of the Year with 3 tackles for loss. He's got a ton of pass breakups. He's got 3 sacks this year, only 1 interception. But this is another game where it seemed like Kyler Murray was kind of avoiding him, and he was picking on other guys. So I thought it was a really good season-ending game for Devon Witherspoon. Now, on special teams, this is going to seem really simple, but at the same time, you mentioned the Seahawks, it was more that the Cardinals lost this game than the Seahawks won it. That was because Matt Prater missed those 2 field goals. The Seahawks, the one constant that they had in this game was Jason Myers going 2 for 2 on his field goals, 2 for 2 on PATs, accounting for 8 total points for the Seahawks. I think sometimes Seahawk fans take for granted how good of a kicker Jason Myers is. And overall, yeah, there were a few hiccups this season, but he really did buck the curse that he had going into this year in odd seasons. And you're hoping that he continues to kick the way he has in even seasons next year. He could have a dominant season for the Seahawks in 2024, but a really strong finish for him in a day where the other team's kicker didn't get the job done down the stretch.
They really didn't, and of course that just reinforces how good that Jason Myers was. I think that the punter Michael Dixon, I think that the long snapper Chris Stoll, I think that they both deserve some credit too. Stoll is an undrafted rookie, Corbin. We never really mentioned him on the show, and nobody else has either, and that is about as strong of an acknowledgement as you possibly can give to a long snapper who, again, was an undrafted free agent that wound up becoming the starter, the only long snapper the Seahawks had on their roster all season long. He was hustling downfield in coverage in this game. It made a couple of, I don't know if he actually ever got credit for an actual tackle, but he definitely was among the very first ones down there on the field in pursuit. And again, it's that type of youth, that type of speed, that type of enthusiasm that I think the Seahawks have been lacking at times. So while I will certainly acknowledge, I think that Jason Myers was the most dependable and the most the flashiest of Seattle special teams players in this football game, I also think that there was some credit to go around on the special teams unit for the Seahawks.
Yeah, that was really the one big positive today, is they were clearly the better team on special teams. And that ultimately was the difference maker of this game, because if the Cardinals get one of those field goals, then obviously the Seahawks go home at 8-9. And not only do they miss the playoffs, but they have a losing record, and it's a completely lost season finale for the Seahawks. When we come back, it's 3 up, 3 down time for the last time this season. Stock watch, which players bolstered their stock in the final game of the year and which ones will be going into the offseason wishing they could have performed a bit better against the Arizona Cardinals. We'll tackle that here in a moment on our post-game edition of Locked On Seahawks. This episode is brought your way by FanDuel. The NFL regular season is wrapping up, but there's still time to get in on the action with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any $5 moneyline bet. That's $150. If you've been thinking about joining FanDuel, there's no better time to get in on the action. The app is so easy to use. There's a wide range of betting options that can be easily found in the Parlay Hub, including spreads such as next week's wild card games, player props. If Josh Allen and the Bills get the number 2 seed, look at the total passing yards at home for Buffalo, over-unders, and more. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and make your first bet a layup. FanDuel, official partner of the NFL. You're listening to the post-game edition of Locked On Seahawks. I'm your host, Corbin Smith. Glad to be joined, as always, by my co-host in crime, Rob Rang. And a special thanks to all the 12s out there. Thank you for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. It's time for our final 3 up, 3 down of the season, our weekly stock watch. Who was hot in today's game and who's going to be going to the offseason wishing they could have played a little bit better in Seattle's season finale? Rob, let's start on the plus side with 3 up, the players who impressed in today's game. Who's a player on the offensive side of the ball that jumps out to you as a candidate that had a strong game for the Seahawks today?
Well, I'm going to mention a player that you just highlighted a couple of moments ago, Corbin, with your game ball, and that being Tyler Lockett. As I've mentioned, I've been very critical of Tyler Lockett, and I thought that on a day in which DK Metcalf is held to 1 catch for essentially 10 yards, you need to have somebody else step up. And was it going to be one of the rookies, Jackson Smith and Jigba, also was held to, much below his, season average. Jake Boba caught 1 pass. Tyler Lockett, Mr. Dependable, wound up catching the touchdown, catching a 2-point conversion that obviously helped the Seahawks win this game. And I also want to mention Will Dissly real quick. I mean, if you would have been betting on FanDuel or whatever different app out there as far as who was going to lead the Seahawks in receptions, I think you probably would have got pretty good odds on whether or not that it would have been Will Dissly in this football game, which is because of the fact that Dissly caught his first touchdown of the season. And so again, that was a surprise, showed some athletic ability and some savvy in doing so. So those are the 2 guys that immediately jump out to me, Corbin, as far as guys that are 3 up. And just really quickly, since I'm stealing the mic here for a moment, this is more an acknowledgement, not only in this game, but all season long, but a tip of the cap to Bobby Wagner. The fact that he, at least when they finished the Seahawks game today, was leading all of the NFL yet again in total tackles, obviously brought a level of maturity, responsibility, integrity to the Seahawks defense, and certainly consistency. So as we often say to all of our listeners, thank you for number 54 because of what he brought to the Seahawks in 2023.
Yeah, he tied Jordan Brooks today for the franchise single-season record. It's a 12th straight year, as we know, with over 100 tackles, leading the league in tackles. And I know there have been times that fans have been wondering about the coverage stuff, but I mean, can you imagine where the Seahawks defense would have been this year without number 54 in the middle, continuing to play at a high level? As he said to reporters today after the game, he's hopeful he's going to be back after this season, come back for another year in Seattle. I am on board. We'll get to free agency stuff, obviously, as we move forward. But I want to mention the 2 running backs. I talked about Ken Walker III earlier. 78 rushing yards. Most of that happened in the first half. The Seahawks had 4 really rough offensive drives to start the second half, which is what made that game-winning drive all the more stunning, is they just turned a light switch on, as they've done so many times this year. And it also makes you wonder, man, if they could have just been a little more consistent. We aren't talking about the Seahawks missing the playoffs right now, but they struggled early on in that half, and they weren't able to get their run game going again. But Walker had 55 rushing yards in the first half on 10 carries. He had a couple fantastic runs that looked like they were going to get stopped for no gain, and he turned them into big runs. There was one that he bounced all the way from the right sideline to the left sideline, turned a 0-yard gain into a 16-yard run, and that set up the Seahawks' first points on a field goal in the first quarter. So he had some really impressive runs in this game. But how about Zach Charbonnet this game, averaging more than 6 yards per carry? He had a couple really nice catches in this football game as well. In that final drive for the Seahawks, he had a couple nice plays. So we get to see the rookie end his season on a strong note too, with that more downhill physical style, the quality receiving skills he brings to the equation. So I got to give a nod to the two running backs. I thought that they played really well today, and the blocking was not always there for them. They made a lot of the yardage that was there, either breaking tackles or, in the case of Ken Walker III, just being ridiculously athletic and being able to outrun guys in pursuit. As for the other side of the coin, in a victory, it's always tougher to look at the players that struggled. But you mentioned Stone Forsythe on the plus side. I don't know if it's going to be viewed as picking on him or not, but Anthony Bradford at the right guard spot, I thought had a pretty tough game. There were a number of times that he got beat. I counted 3 pressures. We'll see what it looks like on film once the All-22 comes out. But there were also a couple of run plays where he got completely obliterated by his opponent, either by power or just straight up whiffing off the line of scrimmage. It's unfortunate to see a rookie finish the season on that note, especially when I think there's been some positives for Anthony Bradford along the way. But this was certainly not one of his better performances. And the Seahawks were able to get most of their rushing yards to the left side today, not to the right side. It's going to be an offseason. They need him to take a big step forward for this offensive line to be much better in 2024.
Yeah, and I think that, I love the fact that you just mentioned Bradford. While we try to be positive on the show, I think that there's going to be a lot of people who, when it comes to game balls, when it comes to these 3 up, 3 down type of scenarios, Corbin, they're going to focus in on the skill position players and very rarely look anywhere else. The fact that you and I are highlighting some players along the line of scrimmage, I think that's why that you stay locked on Seahawks. It's for that type of analysis. So I love that you are acknowledging that. I'm going to mention a player in a similar kind of vein, in that you get these positive moments from a young player like a Bradford, and it kind of builds you up to a certain level of expectation. And so then when he is disappointing, it really does stand out. Well, the same thing for the runner-up to the Defensive Rookie of the Year a season ago in Riq Woolen. And Corbin, the tackling issues that were on tape have, very much returned all throughout this season. And that was unfortunately the case again in this football game. As I mentioned before, James Conner had 150 rushing yards. Kyler Murray, of course, is the jackrabbit that he is. I mean, he just makes people miss, but it's a lot easier to make people miss if you have long arm cornerbacks that aren't going to get down, get low, and wrap up the way that Riq Woolen and any other defensive back really needs to. So again, hugely disappointing in the lack of run support from number 27. He's talented. He is just so one-dimensional at this point that he really is an Achilles heel for the Seahawks in terms of run defense. So I acknowledge the fact. I think that he's a Pro Bowl caliber cover cornerback, but at the same time, it's hard to keep him on the field, and I mean moving forward as well, if he is going to continue to be such a liability in the running game.
Yeah, and I'm going to say one of the other players on the outside, Mike Jackson's been playing plenty, but Trey Brown, when he was in the game today, there were a couple just outrageously bad misses in the run game. It seemed like the Cardinals really, when they got things rolling in the second quarter, it was, again, off edge. The ability to get off tackle, get outside to those quarterbacks. And James Conner's 29-yard touchdown early in the third quarter, Trey Brown had a great opportunity to tackle him. And I don't even know if you want to call that a tackle attempt. It looked like, and I've mentioned the Matador example a couple of times, but it did look like he was pulling back the red cape in front of him and just letting James Conner run through there. And he rumbles untouched from that point, 29 yards for the touchdown. He also gave up a couple of big plays to Michael Wilson in coverage. So I didn't feel like the corners today, away from Devin Witherspoon, who we gave the game ball to, I felt like the guys on the outside, there were some missed tackles. There were some big plays that were given up. Again, the Seahawks gave up 12 explosives. It wasn't just the run plays. You also had screen issues where the corners weren't coming up to make plays on screens. They weren't contributing in that regard. They were giving us some big plays to Michael Wilson downfield. Elijah Higgins had a 25-yard catch. So it was not the best finish for the corners on the outside in terms of what Pete Carroll's looking for. He wants his boundary corners to come up and be physical. We did not see that from the guys that were on the field today on the outside for the Seahawks. That was a big reason the Cardinals ran for 206 yards today, as they did. As always, you can follow me on X and Threads at Corbin Smith NFL. You can follow Rob at Rob Rang. Subscribe and follow Locked On Seahawks on YouTube or wherever you listen to your podcast to make sure you don't miss a single episode. We have appreciated all these post-game shows with you guys this season. It's unfortunate that we're not going to get any playoff post-game shows this year, but nonetheless, Locked On Seahawks will be back tomorrow with Monday mailbag and much more as we start to put a bow on the 2023 season. Enjoy the rest of your Sunday night, and thanks for listening in. Go Hawks.